This is not a proven history. It is not an academic conclusion. It is not a scientific statement. What you are about to hear is a reconstruction built from fragments, ancient texts, unexplained anomalies, and patterns that repeat across cultures separated by oceans and millennia. Some of these sources are accepted, some are controversial, some are openly debated. We will not tell you what to believe. We will not claim that any theory presented here is true. Instead, we will do something far more unsettling. We will place the pieces on the table and ask why they fit together at all. Because across the ancient world, from the earliest written records to the oldest myths, there is a strange consistency, not in names, not in gods, not in symbols, but in structure. Stories of rulers before memory, a sudden global catastrophe, a sharp divide between a world that existed before and the world that followed, civilizations that appear already formed, knowledge that seems inherited rather than discovered, and numbers so large, so precise, that dismissing them as fantasy becomes uncomfortable. So we will proceed carefully. We will question assumptions. We will examine what is usually skipped. And when certainty ends, we will not replace it with belief. We will replace it with a question. What if some ancient records were not written to explain the past, but to preserve it? And what if history, as we know it, didn't begin where we think it did, but resumed? There is a document older than most civilizations, older than Egypt, older than the pyramids, older than history as we normally define it. It is not a mythological poem. It is not a religious text. It is not a legend passed down by storytellers. It is a list, names, numbers, exact measurements of rule. Kings recorded with the same precision we use for accounting, but the numbers are wrong, not slightly wrong, not exaggerated, not symbolic at first glance, impossibly large. One ruler is said to reign for 28,800 years, another for 36,000, another for 43,200. Together they rule for more than 200,000 years. No metaphor explains that easily. No allegory requires that level of mathematical consistency. And then, without warning, the record breaks. No transition, no explanation, no moral lesson, just one sentence. Then the flood swept over. After that line, everything changes. The next kings rule for decades. Their cities can be located. Their names appear on bricks, seals, foundations. Archaeology confirms them, which creates a problem. If the later part of the record aligns with reality, why is the earlier part automatically dismissed? Why preserve impossible data at all? Why carve such precise numbers into clay if they were never meant to be taken seriously? What if these weren't myths trying to explain the world, but records trying to survive a catastrophe? What if history didn't begin after the flood? What if it resumed? You're the document that breaks chronology, and the document exists, not as a rumor, not as a second-hand reference, but as a physical object, copied, studied, translated, and cataloged. It is known today as a king list. At first glance, it appears ordinary. A simple administrative record, rulers, cities, lengths of reign. This is exactly the kind of text historians trust the most. It doesn't praise, it doesn't preach, it doesn't explain, it records. And that is what makes it dangerous. Because when scholars compare the later names on the list to archaeological evidence, something remarkable happens. They match. Cities mentioned after the flood can be excavated. Dynasties align with known timelines. Some rulers appear on multiple independent inscriptions. The list behaves like history until it doesn't. At the top of the document, before the flood, the structure remains the same, but the content shifts into something that no longer fits our understanding of time. The same format, the same precision, the same accounting style, but the reigns stretch far beyond any human lifespan. Historians are faced with a dilemma. If the entire list were fictional, it could be dismissed. If the entire list were symbolic, interpretation would be easy. But it isn't. Part of the document is demonstrably accurate. Part of it is mathematically structured. And part of it describes a world that should not have existed. So scholars compromise. They draw a line. Everything after the flood is treated as history. Everything before it is treated as myth. But the text itself does not make that distinction. There is no change in language, no shift in tone, no indication that the scribes switch from record-keeping to storytelling. The flood is the only divider, which raises an uncomfortable question. Why would a civilization that invented writing, a civilization obsessed with order, measurement, and record-keeping, preserve data they believe to be meaningless? Why record exact reign lengths instead of saying long ago or in the time of the gods? Why use the same numerical system for impossible kings that they later used for kings we can verify? Some researchers suggest symbolism, others suggest exaggeration. But symbolism does not require precision, and exaggeration does not usually obey strict numerical patterns. This document does both, which forces a different possibility into view. What if the list was never intended to explain the past? What if it was meant to preserve it? What if these entries are not stories, but archival remnants from a time when the rules were different? And if that is even remotely possible, then the question is no longer who were these kings? The question becomes, what kind of world requires a flood to separate its history from ours? 8 rulers beyond human limits. The list does not describe dozens of ancient rulers. It describes 8, not a dynasty, not a lineage branching through generations. 8 figures, one after another, ruling in uninterrupted succession, no overlap, no gaps, no civil wars, no competing claims, just continuity. Each ruler governs alone. Each reign lasts tens of thousands of years, and when one ends, the next begins immediately. That detail matters, because in human history, continuity is rare. Even the most stable empires fracture, divide, collapse, and reform. But this record describes something else entirely, a system that does not rely on inheritance, a structure that does not change with generations, a form of rule that appears stable, too stable. The names themselves are strange. They do not follow later naming conventions. They do not resemble royal titles or honorifics. They are short, repetitive, almost technical, and they are always listed in the same order. 8 rulers, 8 reigns, one complete sequence. There is no explanation for why there are 8. The text does not say they were chosen. It does not say they were related. It does not say they replaced one another through conflict or succession. It simply states that kingship existed and that it passed through them. Some scholars interpret these figures as gods, others as mythical ancestors. But that interpretation introduces a contradiction. Gods do not need reign lengths. Mythical figures are not usually measured with accounting precision. Yet here, each reign is recorded down to exact units. Not many generations, not countless ages. exact numbers, which suggests that whatever these rulers were, they were governed by rules. Rules of duration, rules of succession, rules of continuity. And this leads to an unsettling reframing. What if kingship did not originally mean political power? What if it described a function, a role, a position, a station within a larger system? In modern terms, we would not call such figures kings at all. We might call them custodians, administrators, controllers of a process. And if that sounds strange, consider this. The list does not describe what they conquered. It does not praise their achievements. It does not credit them with monuments or wars. It only records how long they held authority, as if duration itself was the point, as if their purpose was not to change the world, but to maintain it. So the question shifts again. What if these 8 rulers were not extraordinary humans? What if they were not gods in the mythological sense? What if they were something closer to a stabilizing presence? And if so, what kind of instability required 8 successive rulers over 200,000 years to keep the system intact? Numbers that are too precise. At first, the numbers look impossible, too large to belong to human lifespans, too extreme to fit any known historical framework. But when researchers stop reacting to the size of the numbers and start examining their structure, something unusual emerges. They are not random. They repeat again and again. The same values appear. 28,800, 36,000, 43,200. Not approximate figures, not rounded estimates, exact intervals. And when these numbers are converted into the numerical system used by the scribes who recorded them, an unexpected pattern appears. They are all clean multiples of a single base unit, a unit deeply embedded in the mathematics of that civilization, a unit used for counting time, space, and cycles. Not symbolism, infrastructure. The same base appears in their calendars, in their geometry, in their astronomical calculations, which creates a contradiction. If the numbers were symbolic, why align them so perfectly with a working mathematical system? Symbolism usually bends numbers. It exaggerates. It rounds. These do the opposite. They lock into place. Some scholars suggest that the reigns were not measured in years, but in cycles. Others propose that time itself may have been defined differently, not by the orbit of Earth around the Sun, but by larger celestial patterns, longer rhythms, slower clocks. And this is where the list becomes especially uncomfortable, because the scribes did not annotate these entries. They did not warn the reader. They did not mark them as ancient, mythic, or symbolic. They recorded them the same way they recorded everything else, as if the numbers were self-explanatory, as if anyone reading the list at the time would understand exactly what they meant, which leads to a difficult question. What if we are misreading the units? What if years is the wrong translation? What if these reigns were measured not by human lifetimes, but by operational durations, by cycles of responsibility, by periods of function? And if time before the flood was measured differently, then the flood was not just a disaster, it was a conversion, a reset of the clock. After the flood, the numbers collapse, the units shrink, time becomes human-scaled, shorter lives, faster change, rapid decay, which suggests something more than destruction. It suggests a shift in conditions, environmental, biological, or systemic. So the question sharpens. What if time itself did not flow the same way before the flood? And if that sounds impossible, consider this. Time is not absolute. It is measured, and measurements depend on systems. What if the system that governed the world before the flood was not the same system we live under now? And if that system failed, what else collapsed with it? Myths that remember the same event. The pattern does not end with one civilization. If it did, the explanation would be easy. Local mythology, cultural imagination, an isolated anomaly, but the same structure appears again, and again, and again, in texts written thousands of kilometers apart by cultures that never met, using languages that share no common root, different names, different symbols, the same sequence. A distant age before memory, rulers who lived far longer than humans should, a sudden global catastrophe, a world that restarts afterward, diminished. In ancient Hebrew texts, the earliest patriarchs lived for centuries. Adam, Seth, Methuselah, Noah, and then the flood. After it, lifespans collapse. In Egypt, priestly king lists speak of divine rulers before the pharaohs, the Negeru, kings who ruled for thousands of years before the first mortal dynasty. After the great inundation, human kings, human reigns. In India, the concept of vast ages appears, yugas that stretch beyond counting, a golden age where gods and humans coexist, followed by collapse, shortening cycles, degeneration. In Mesoamerica, time itself is cyclical. Worlds are created, destroyed, recreated, floods, fire, sky catastrophes, always the same rhythm: creation, stability, collapse, restart. What is striking is not the presence of catastrophe. Catastrophes happen. What is striking is where the line is drawn. Before the catastrophe, extended lifespans, direct interaction with higher beings, advanced knowledge attributed to a previous age. After, fragmentation, loss, rebuilding from remnants. And none of these cultures describe the event as gradual. It is always sudden, decisive, final, which raises a problem. If these stories were purely symbolic, why do they align so precisely in structure? Why does the same break appear everywhere? Why does memory consistently fail at the same boundary? Some argue this is psychological, that humans naturally imagine a lost golden age. But psychology does not produce matching timelines. It does not create identical narrative architecture across isolated civilizations. Unless those civilizations were remembering something, not clearly, not accurately, but consistently. So the question shifts again. What if myths are not inventions? What if they are degraded records? Memories passed down orally until only the shape remained. The outline of something too large, too traumatic, too disruptive to preserve in detail. And if multiple cultures remember a flood, a reset, and a break between two kinds of humanity, then the flood may not be the question. The real question becomes, what kind of world existed before that so many civilizations remember losing it? The flood as a global reset. Floods happen, rivers overflow, coasts disappear, cities are swallowed by water. But the event described across ancient texts is not local. It is not seasonal. It is not regional. It is absolute. The language used is always the same. The whole world, all lands, everything under the sky. Even cultures separated by oceans describe the catastrophe as something that erased boundaries entirely. Water from above, water from below. the collapse of what separated sky, land, and sea. This is where interpretations usually stop. A mythic flood, a moral lesson, a symbolic cleansing. But symbolism does not require engineering-level detail. Yet many accounts describe mechanisms, gates of heaven opening, foundations of the deep breaking apart, the sky behaving unnaturally. Some texts even specify durations, exact numbers of days, measured phases of rising and retreating waters, which suggests observation, not metaphor. So researchers begin asking a different kind of question. What kind of event could produce global flooding without relying on a single source of water? One theory points to rapid glacial melt, another to comet impact, others to sudden tectonic shifts. But each explanation alone falls short, because the flood is not remembered as a slow disaster. It is remembered as a reset, as if a system failed. And when systems fail, they do not degrade gradually, they collapse catastrophically. This reframes the flood entirely. What if it was not just water? What if water was a symptom? If the planet's equilibrium shifted, atmospheric pressure, orbital stability, magnetic fields, oceans would not behave normally, clouds would not behave normally, time itself might not behave normally. And if a global system had existed before the flood, one that regulated climate, environment, or even biology, then its failure would not look like a storm. It would look like the world falling apart. After the flood, everything is smaller, shorter lifespans, simpler technology, fragmented knowledge. Civilization does not resume at the level it left off. It restarts at a lower resolution, which suggests something more deliberate than chaos. What if the flood was not just destruction, but deactivation, a shutdown of whatever sustained the previous world? And if that is even remotely possible, then the most dangerous question is not what caused the flood. It is, what was running the world before it failed? Ziggurats and pyramids, part of a system, not monuments. Across the ancient world, the same shape appears, stepped, massive, oriented with unnatural precision. Ziggurats in Mesopotamia, pyramids in Egypt, platform mounds in the Americas, temple mountains in Asia, different cultures, different materials, the same architectural logic. These structures are not placed randomly. They align with cardinal directions. They mirror celestial patterns. They repeat proportions that have no obvious religious necessity. And most importantly, they appear fully developed. There is no clear trial phase, no crude prototypes leading slowly to perfection. The earliest examples already display advanced geometry, astronomical alignment, construction techniques that strain even modern explanations. This is usually explained away as coincidence, independent invention, human ingenuity reaching similar solutions. But that explanation becomes fragile when the similarities stack too high, because these structures are not just similar in form, they are similar in behavior. Many are built on fault lines, on ley-like alignments, on points where geological energy behaves unusually. Some contain materials that conduct electricity. Others show signs of heat exposure far beyond ceremonial use. And nearly all of them share one feature rarely discussed. They are not designed to be entered casually. Narrow stairways, restricted chambers, elevated platforms inaccessible to the general population. They are not public spaces. They are interfaces. This leads to a quiet but profound shift in interpretation. What if these structures were not built for people? What if they were built around something? something that required height, isolation, precise orientation, massive stability. In modern terms, we would not call these temples. We would call them nodes, connection points. If a global system existed before the flood, one that regulated climate, time, or environment, it would require infrastructure, fixed locations, standardized design, redundancy across continents, and redundancy only makes sense if failure is anticipated, which brings us back to the flood. Many of these structures show signs of abandonment, not destruction. They were not smashed, they were left, as if they stopped working. So the question sharpens again. What if pyramids and ziggurats were not symbols of power, but components of a network? And if that network failed during the flood, what exactly was it controlling? When knowledge becomes dangerous, every civilization tells a version of the same warning. Knowledge is not neutral. There is a point beyond which it becomes dangerous. In ancient stories, that boundary is never vague. It is guarded, restricted, punished when crossed. In Mesopotamia, knowledge is taken from the gods. In the Bible, it is eaten from a tree. In Greece, it is stolen fire. In India, it is sacred science revealed too early. Different metaphors, same structure. Someone learned something they were not meant to know, and the consequences are immediate. Expulsion, collapse, catastrophe. Modern readers often dismiss these stories as moral lessons, warnings against arrogance, parables about obedience. But parables usually exaggerate consequences to make a point. These stories do the opposite. They describe consequences with uncomfortable precision: loss of lifespan, loss of access, loss of communication with higher realms. Afterward, humanity is not destroyed, it is limited. This suggests a different interpretation. What if these stories are not about moral failure, but about thresholds? In complex systems, thresholds matter. Below a certain level, growth is harmless. Beyond it, instability emerges. Nuclear physics works the same way. So does artificial intelligence. So does genetic engineering. At first, progress is linear, then suddenly it is exponential. And exponential systems require control. So what if ancient civilizations were allowed to advance, but only up to a point? What if knowledge itself triggered safeguards? Consider this detail. The most dangerous knowledge in ancient texts is never farming, medicine, or architecture. It is astronomy, timekeeping, creation itself, knowledge of cycles, knowledge of origins, knowledge of how the system works. And once that knowledge spreads too far, something intervenes, not subtly, decisively. This reframes the flood again, not as punishment, not as accident, but as enforcement, a hard boundary. And if that boundary existed once, the most unsettling question is not whether it existed at all. It is whether it still exists. And if it does, how close are we to crossing it again? The conflict of the creators. Ancient texts rarely describe a single unified authority. Instead, they speak of councils, assemblies, groups of higher beings who do not always agree. In Mesopotamian records, the gods argue. In Greek mythology, they conspire and rebel. In Egyptian texts, divine factions rule different regions. In Mesoamerican stories, previous gods fail and are replaced. This is usually explained as storytelling drama. But drama has a pattern, and this pattern repeats too consistently to ignore. The catastrophe is never described as a random collapse. It follows a disagreement, a fracture, a decision made under pressure. which suggests that whatever governed the world before the flood was not a single, infallible intelligence. It was a system with internal conflict. Some figures are described as teachers, others as enforcers. Some grant knowledge, others restrict it. Progress versus stability, expansion versus control. If these stories are interpreted symbolically, they still describe something familiar. Every advanced system faces this tension. Engineers want efficiency, regulators want safety, scientists push boundaries, administrators impose limits. Now imagine that dynamic applied to an entire civilization or an entire species. What if some of the creators believed humanity should continue advancing? What if others believed that advancement threatened the balance of the system itself? In that scenario, collapse would not be accidental. It would be a decision. Not necessarily malicious, preventative, and this would explain something strange. The flood does not erase everything. Some knowledge survives, some structures remain, some people are spared. Selective preservation is not how natural disasters behave. It is how controlled shutdowns behave. This reframes ancient stories of divine conflict, not as wars with weapons and armies, but as disagreements over policy, over thresholds, over whether humanity had crossed a line it could not uncross. And if that is even a possibility, then the most disturbing thought is not that the flood happened. It is that it was allowed to happen, or worse, initiated. Could why memory was erased. After the catastrophe, something strange happens. Not just to cities, not just to technology, but to memory itself. Civilizations rebuild, but they do not resume. They start again, slowly, imperfectly, as if working from fragments. Writing disappears, advanced metallurgy vanishes, astronomical precision is lost, and then, centuries later, these things are rediscovered, not inherited, reinvented. This is one of the most puzzling features of early history. Human capability does not increase smoothly. It spikes, collapses, spikes again. Dark ages appear suddenly. Entire skill sets vanish without gradual decline. If destruction were the only factor, memory would persist. Survivors would teach what they knew. Parents would pass knowledge to children. But that is not what we see. Instead, we see deliberate gaps. Techniques that should have survived didn't. Knowledge that required generations to develop disappeared overnight, which raises a difficult question. What if forgetting was not a side effect? What if it was intentional? In modern systems, when failure occurs, one of the first responses is data control. Sensitive information is restricted, archives are sealed, access is removed, not to punish, but to prevent repetition. Ancient stories hint at something similar. Languages are confused, people are scattered, lifespans shorten dramatically. These are not just consequences of disaster. They are constraints, limits placed on how quickly complexity can return. If humanity before the flood had access to advanced knowledge, knowledge that destabilized the system, then erasing memory would be the most effective reset, not erasing humanity, erasing its momentum. This also explains why remnants remain, monuments too large to dismantle, structures too embedded to remove, stories too deeply encoded to fully erase. Memory survives, but in distorted form, as myth, as legend, as symbolism, enough to warn, not enough to rebuild, which leads to a disturbing possibility. What if ancient civilizations were not wiped out by ignorance, but protected from themselves? And if forgetting was engineered once before, the most unsettling question is not why it happened then. It is, would it happen again? To modern anomalies. If the past were completely erased, this story would end in myth. But it doesn't, because pieces remain, not where they should be, not when they should exist. Modern archaeology is full of quiet anomalies. Stone blocks weighing hundreds of tons, cut with precision that exceeds the limits of the tools supposedly used. Structures aligned to celestial events that require long-term astronomical observation to calculate accurately. Sites dated to periods when, according to conventional timelines, no organized civilization should have existed at all. These discoveries are rarely presented as revolutions. They are categorized carefully, explained cautiously, sometimes ignored, not because they are false, but because they do not fit cleanly. A single anomaly can be dismissed. Several can be debated. But when anomalies repeat across continents, across disciplines, across centuries of excavation, they form a pattern. Consider how often ancient structures appear suddenly in the archaeological record. No gradual buildup, no long experimental phase. They arrive almost complete, then disappear. Knowledge appears, is used briefly, then vanishes. This is not how linear progress behaves. This is how inheritance behaves. Fragments passed down without full understanding, like finding the ruins of a machine without knowing what it was designed to do. Modern instruments detect things the ancient builders could not have measured directly, yet the measurements are embedded in the structures. Earth's circumference, precession of the equinoxes, precise solar and stellar cycles. These are not guesses, they are accurate. And accuracy implies access, which leads to an uncomfortable reframing. What if early civilizations were not discovering these principles for the first time? What if they were rediscovering them? What if they were working from remnants of a previous system, tools they could use but not recreate? This would explain why progress stalls, why knowledge appears, disappears, and reappears centuries later. It would explain why myths speak of teachers from the sky, of gods who taught humanity and then left. Not because they were divine, but because they belonged to an earlier phase of the system. And if we are now finding these anomalies again, with satellites, scanners, and algorithms, then we may be repeating the same cycle, rediscovering fragments without understanding the whole, which raises a quiet but urgent question. What happens when a civilization uncovers tools built for a system it no longer remembers? Cycles in history. History is usually taught as a straight line. Stone tools to bronze, bronze to iron. Empires rising higher than the last. Progress. But when historians zoom out far enough, that line begins to curve. Then it bends. Then it repeats. Golden ages are followed by collapse. Knowledge peaks, then disappears. Civilizations rise with confidence, then vanish almost overnight. This pattern is not occasional. It is constant. The Bronze Age collapses across the Mediterranean within decades. Trade routes die. Writing systems disappear. Cities burn and are never rebuilt. The Roman world fractures. Engineering knowledge is lost. Concrete formulas vanish for over 1,000 years. China experiences dynastic cycles so regular they were written into philosophy itself. Mesoamerican civilizations abandon cities at their peak, not after defeat, but after something breaks internally. These are not slow declines, they are resets. And resets suggest limits. In ecology, systems collapse when growth exceeds stability. In economics, bubbles burst when complexity outpaces control. In technology, feedback loops spiral when safeguards fail. Why would civilization be different? What if history doesn't move forward, but loops? Each cycle starts small. Each cycle builds faster than the last. Each cycle reaches a threshold, and then something intervenes. Sometimes it is environmental, sometimes social, sometimes unknown. The myths call it gods. Modern language calls it collapse, but the shape is the same: rise, acceleration, destabilization, reset. The most unsettling detail is this: every new cycle believes it is the first. Each one assumes the past was primitive. Each one believes collapse happens to others. And yet, every civilization leaves behind the same warning. Not carved clearly, not explained openly, encoded in stories of floods, in forbidden knowledge, in gods who leave when humans become too much, which leads to a final, unavoidable question. If history loops, where are we in the cycle now? Our threshold. For most of human history, progress was slow. Generations passed with little change. Knowledge accumulated carefully, incrementally. That is no longer true. In the span of a single lifetime, we split the atom, left the planet, created machines that learn. Artificial intelligence now processes information faster than any human mind ever could. It recognizes patterns we cannot see. It makes decisions we do not fully understand. Nuclear technology gave us energy and the ability to erase cities in seconds. Genetic engineering allows us to rewrite life itself, not symbolically, literally. And for the first time, humanity is no longer limited by its environment. We alter climate. We reshape ecosystems. We move faster than evolution ever intended. This is the moment ancient stories seem to point toward. Not a specific invention, not a single breakthrough, but a convergence. Multiple systems accelerating at once. Technology, information, power. In complex systems theory, this is called a critical point, a threshold beyond which outcomes become unpredictable. Small inputs create massive effects. Errors propagate faster than they can be corrected. And every ancient story places the collapse right here, at the moment when humans gain access to forces once attributed to gods. Fire, creation, destruction, knowledge of the cycles. What makes this moment different is that we are aware of it. We study collapse. We model it. We warn ourselves. But awareness does not guarantee control. In fact, it often accelerates risk, because knowing something is dangerous does not mean we will stop using it. So the question ancient texts leave us with is no longer abstract. It is immediate. What if previous civilizations reached the same point, this convergence of power, and crossed it? What if the flood, the reset, the erasure was not punishment, but containment? And if that containment was triggered once before, then the final question is not whether history repeats itself. It is whether we recognize the moment when repetition becomes inevitable. The question that remains. There is something unsettling about the way ancient stories end. Not with triumph, not with closure, but with silence. After the flood, after the fire, after the reset, the world does not remember. Cities vanish beneath sediment. Languages fracture. Numbers shrink. Lifespans shorten. And humanity begins again believing it is early in the story. But what if it isn't? What if history is not a straight line, but a recurring test? Again and again, civilizations rise. They discover mathematics. They master energy. They learn to manipulate matter. They begin to understand the fabric of reality itself. And again, something happens at the edge of that understanding. A collapse, a reset, a forgetting, not always violent, not always global, but always effective. Enough is lost that the next civilization must start over. We tell ourselves that this time is different, that we are smarter, that we have safeguards, that technology will save us from ourselves. But every civilization that collapsed believed the same thing. And this is where the ancient question becomes personal. If advanced civilizations existed before us, and if they disappeared after crossing a threshold, then the most important question is not who they were. It is not whether gods existed, or whether the flood was literal, or whether the numbers were symbolic. The question is simpler and far more dangerous. Will we recognize the moment when history asks us the same question again? Not in fire, not in water, but in choice. Because if the past is any indication, collapse does not arrive as a surprise. It arrives as a decision that seems reasonable at the time. And by the time it is understood, the story has already ended. For now, we are still inside the question. And that may be the only difference that still matters.